after the turmoil and the revolution and the usual dislocation caused by great revolutions, there has been an implicit social contract. You stay out of politics, and we see to it that your incomes grow, there is stability, and there's certain semblance of at least personal security. So let's start with this contract between the people and the regime. It's under threat. So let's first discuss what do you think the reaction of the people will be, and also what do you think the regime will do to survive?
Well, I think two things are certain. First of all, that there was indeed such an implicit social contract, as you mentioned, and secondly, that it is under severe threat, and the Kremlin is increasingly struggling to fulfill its end of that social conflict. The situation, the economic situation in our country today is indeed in free fall.
Tell us what you see when you travel, especially in provinces. I understand the situation is getting to be quite dire.
Sure. Well, even if we look at all the major indicators, even at the surface, we'll see a double-digit inflation. We'll see a massive devaluation of the national currency, more than 100% since 2014.
Correct.
We're seeing a decline in the GDP. We're seeing a decline and fall in real incomes to the level of more than a decade ago. And sure, this is caused to a major extent by falling oil prices, but here it also has to be mentioned that during his rule, Putin has actually increased the dependence of the Russian economy on oil prices. Oil and gas accounted for 40% of Russian exports when Putin came to power. Today it accounts for 70% of Russian exports. And also it's the actions of the regime, such as the so-called counter-sanctions that you mentioned, also that hit Russian consumers much harder than they did the intended recipients, but also the sanctions themselves that have been caused by flagrant violations of international law, which was also what the Kremlin regime did. Nobody forced them to do it. It was their choice to do it, and these are the consequences. So we're seeing a major, obviously, deterioration of the economy. And also, for example, going back to the oil prices, today it's about $30 a barrel, and we're seeing 4 to 5% decline in GDP. When Mikhail Kasyanov, for instance, was prime minister, the oil price was about $20 to $25 a barrel, and we saw 7 to 8% growth every year. So it's not just, we can't blame everything, or the Kremlin rather, cannot blame everything on just oil prices. It's also the mismanagement, it's also the destructions of institutions, it's also the enormous level of corruption, official corruption, that I think it's safe to say is now at the highest level it's ever been in Russian history. So it's certain, I think, that the Kremlin is increasingly struggling to fulfill its part of the social contract, so in economic terms. So in order to maintain its grip on power, they're increasingly turning to repression and to a relentless propaganda, finding the external enemies, rallying up against them, all these usual things,
right.
All these usual tricks that are not new.
Right.
And we as historians, we both saw many examples of this in history. But we also saw that these tricks and these attempts to hold on to power usually end the same way. And I think a very good parallel would be what happened in our own country, in Russia, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when, as you remember, the political control of the communist establishment remained in place, the propaganda machine over television remained in place, but it simply became less and less and less effective as the economic reality increasingly diverged from the propaganda image. This is the proverbial battle between the television set and the fridge. And the fridge always wins, certainly in Russia, always wins. And I think however much the current regime will try to cling to its power, again by finding enemies, by rallying up its propaganda machine, by increasing repression and tightening the screws, as it were, I think the end result will be the same. Unfortunately, and this is a very big problem, and the Kremlin likes to accuse us, members of the Russian opposition, of being revolutionaries and preparing for a Russian Maidan. And of course, I would say that the biggest revolutionaries of all are people in the Kremlin itself today, because they're the ones who destroyed all the institutions of state, who turned elections into a meaningless farce, who turned parliament into not a place for discussion, as they themselves famously said, who turned all the major media outlets into weapons of its propaganda machine, and thus destroyed and eliminated every single legal and constitutional way of changing the government. And in doing so, they ensure that whenever change does come to Russia, political change, and nothing is forever, and nothing is permanent, that this change will take the shape of some kind of a revolutionary process. It's the Kremlin themselves, it's Vladimir Putin himself, who ensure that this will be the case. And I'm not saying it with any pleasure, because as a historian, as you said, which I am, I don't think that revolutions are necessarily a force for good, especially in our own Russian history. But this is what the Kremlin's actions are leading to, that whenever change does come to our country, and again, it will come, nothing is forever, it will come in some kind of a revolutionary form.